She was warned, "Never show your teeth." A smile could be seen as mockery, and mockery in the hands of the enemy could mean punishment. But now, standing at the edge of a sunlit clearing in Texas, the young Japanese woman squinted at the sight in front of her. Dust kicked up from boots, not combat boots, cowboy boots. The guards weren't shouting, they were singing. One strummed a guitar, another tipped his hat. One had an actual lasso looped at his side. They weren't mocking them, they were performing. And then it happened. One of the women laughed, out loud, a clear, startled, involuntary laugh. She clapped her hand to her mouth, horrified. But instead of being struck, she heard a voice. Southern, drawled, almost amused. "Ain't no crime to laugh, darlin'. You're alive, ain't you?" She froze. The myth cracked. This wasn't war anymore. It was something far more dangerous. It was kindness. They had been taught that to surrender was a disgrace worse than death. For these young women, many barely past their teens, captivity was not survival. It was obliteration of the self. In their training halls, under banners of the rising sun, officers had spoken in cold absolutes. A captured woman is not a soldier, not a servant of the emperor. She is dishonored. The echoes of those lessons had followed them through the jungles of the Philippines, the ashes of Okinawa, and now across the vast Pacific. They had whispered the oath with bowed heads, better to die than fall into enemy hands. Those words had once felt righteous, a promise carved in bone. But now, standing on the dry dirt of an American camp under an open sky, their bodies wrapped in fatigue and sweat, that promise began to shiver. The land was too quiet, the guards too calm, the sun beat down without menace, and in the distance someone laughed, a laugh that did not belong to a victor gloating over captives, but to a man enjoying the heat of the afternoon. It unsettled them more than a slap would have. The camp itself was strange. Neat rows of barracks, wooden fences lined with barbed wire, but no dogs, no screams. The women were marched past a vegetable patch, actual green growing from the soil. One woman blinked at the sight of cornstalks, absurdly tall and swaying like dancers. Another whispered that this couldn't be real. A few stumbled, tripping over exhaustion and disbelief. But the guards didn't shout. One even extended a hand to help a woman up. She recoiled as though touched by fire. They had expected snarling Americans, monstrous men who would spit in their faces and throw them in mud. Instead, they got men who walked with a casual slouch, rifles slung low, one of them with his hat tilted back like a character from a storybook. A cowboy. It was impossible. Cowboys were myths, like samurai, unreal, romantic, and utterly foreign. And now the myth of the monster was being peeled back, one quiet moment at a time. Still, they did not speak. Their silence was their last defense. When names were called, they answered only with a nod or averted eyes. One woman whispered to another, "Don't let them see you smile." Because even if this wasn't torture, even if there was no shouting, there had to be humiliation waiting somewhere. The enemy was not supposed to be polite. He was supposed to be cruel. Inside the intake tent, the air smelled of dust, sweat, and unfamiliar soap. Their uniforms, stained with salt and fear, were taken away, replaced with plain dresses, cotton underwear, and a pair of soft canvas shoes. One young woman stared at the folded garments in her hands, as if they might vanish the moment she touched them. Another examined a comb, wrapped in paper, as if it were a trap. When a guard handed her a towel, she flinched. He didn't react, just nodded once and stepped back. The distance he kept struck her harder than a shove. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Somewhere a harmonica began to play. The notes floated lazily, as if even music here wasn't in a hurry. A strange stillness settled over the group. They had expected something else. Screams, chains, cold hunger. Not this. Waiting. Not this quiet. One woman, a former field nurse, stood near the barrack door and glanced up at the flag above the guard tower. Stars, stripes. It fluttered in the wind with no hatred in its movement. She felt a cold sweat on her neck. Her world had been strict lines and shouted truths. Here there was too much space, too much sky. That night, as they lay on unfamiliar beds with stiff white sheets, the silence pressed harder than any noise. They heard no beatings, no boots, just wind against the walls and the distant buzz of insects. One woman rolled to her side and whispered into the dark, "This doesn't make sense." Another murmured back, "Maybe that's the point." They didn't know it yet, but the real battle had just begun. Not with fists or guns, but with everything they had been told to believe. The enemy wasn't cruel. The camp wasn't hell. And slowly, unbearably, that truth would begin to seep under their skin. They weren't being broken. They were being shown something worse, something they had no defense against: kindness. The next morning arrived with no bugle, no barked orders, just the soft warmth of sunlight creeping through the slats in the barrack walls and the smell of something frying. For a few moments they lay still, convinced it was a dream. But the scent persisted, something savory, unfamiliar yet unmistakably indulgent. When the door opened and a guard called them for breakfast, his voice was level, unhurried. They stepped outside into air that was fresh and wide. The sky stretched open above them in a blue so vast it made one woman dizzy. They were still fenced in, yes, but outside the wire, the grass swayed, children's laughter echoed faintly from the nearby town, and in the far distance a horse snorted. It was a geography that made no sense. Behind them, their world had collapsed in fire. Here, the world had not even flinched. Inside the mess hall, the contradictions only deepened. The room was plain but clean, its long wooden tables wiped and ready. Steam rose from trays of scrambled eggs, potatoes, and sausage. There was even bread, white, soft, sliced. The kind of bread that hadn't existed in Japan in years. One woman stared at her plate so long, the guard behind the counter asked gently, "You okay, ma'am?" She didn't know the words, but the tone pierced her. She nodded, sat, and ate. The food was heavy in her mouth. Her body thanked her with every bite, but her mind recoiled. Was this nourishment or surrender? Later that day, a medic walked into the barracks with a clipboard. They were told it was a health inspection. The women tensed, bracing for cold hands, groping, shame. But the medic, a young man with sunburned cheeks and a badge shaped like a red cross, knelt before each woman with practiced care. He asked no questions that weren't necessary. He cleaned wounds, handed out aspirin, and even offered bandages that smelled faintly of mint. When he reached one woman's bruised ankle, she flinched. He paused, made eye contact, and waited. Then, slowly, she let him touch it. The bandage was soft. The silence around them was softer. In the afternoon, a handful of guards led the women into the open yard. There, beneath the blistering sun, something surreal unfolded. One of the soldiers, barely older than the prisoners, stepped forward wearing a cowboy hat. He tipped it low and drawled, "Welcome to Texas." His accent twisted the words into something foreign and musical. Then another joined him, holding a rope looped into a lasso. The first guard reached into his pocket and pulled out a harmonica. A few notes squealed out, clumsy but cheerful. At first, the women stood frozen. Was this a performance? A punishment? But the men weren't laughing at them. They were just playing. One pretended to rope in the other like a wild steer, and the rest burst into laughter. The guards laughed too, shaking their heads, tipping hats, wiping sweat from their necks. Then it happened. One of the Japanese women, young, bone-thin, her hair tied in a knot, giggled. It escaped her before she could catch it. A sharp, startled sound, like something cracking open. She clapped her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with shame. But no punishment came. One of the guards turned, smiled, and said, "Glad you liked the show, miss." She didn't know the words, but she understood the smile. Back in the barracks, the silence was different. Not heavy, not fearful, just full, like the air before a summer storm. They were still prisoners, but the lines between enemy and entertainer, guard and guest, had blurred in the afternoon sun. That evening, as they folded their blankets and laid down on their bunks, a thought crept in, a thought as forbidden as a smile. Maybe the enemy wasn't here to break them. Maybe he was trying to remind them they were still alive. The smell came before the sunrise. It drifted through the barracks window like a phantom, thick, greasy, unmistakably foreign. One woman stirred on her bunk, her stomach tightening before her eyes even opened. Another sat bolt upright, sniffing the air with disbelief. For a moment they thought it was a dream, or worse, a cruel joke. But then the bell rang for breakfast, and the scent only grew stronger. Bacon. It was a word that lived in memory, not reality. Bacon belonged to a world of luxury, of childhood kitchens and quiet mornings. In Japan, food had long since stopped being a comfort. Hunger was discipline. Meals were rationed, stripped of joy. By the end of the war, civilians boiled bark, soldiers shared slivers of rice, and here, behind enemy fences, that smell now wafted like a sin. They lined up in silence, bodies hollowed by months of deprivation. One woman near the front whispered that it had to be for the Americans. It couldn't be for them. But when the door opened, they saw trays, real trays, lined with scrambled eggs, potatoes, slices of bread, and two glistening strips of bacon laid across the top like a crown. The guards served them without expression, no smirks, no mocking, just food. The young woman from Osaka held her tray like it might burn her. Her hands trembled. She stared at the bacon, her mouth watering against her will. Her body had already decided. It wanted it. But her mind screamed that to take it was treason, that her brothers had died for less, that to eat well under the enemy's roof was to spit on her family's suffering. So she sat down, turned her back to the others, and ate with her shoulders hunched, each bite swallowed like a secret. Another woman tucked half her bread into the sleeve of her uniform. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe she thought the food would stop tomorrow. Maybe she just couldn't bear the idea of throwing any of it away. Across the room, someone made a sound. It wasn't a sob or a gasp, but something more dangerous, a laugh. It was short and high, born out of disbelief. A woman had taken a bite of the bacon and closed her eyes like she was being kissed. She laughed because she had forgotten what taste was. She laughed because it felt wrong to feel good. Then she covered her mouth, ashamed. But no one scolded her. No one hit her. The guards just watched quietly from the wall. One of them leaned over to the cook and said something in English, too low to hear. The cook smiled, shrugged. Another woman reached across the table and touched her friend's arm. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. Her voice was shaking. "But it's not war." The mess hall buzzed with quiet chewing, utensils scraping on metal trays, eyes darting. It felt like sitting in a theater waiting for the curtain to drop. Any moment now, the trap would spring. The humiliation would come. But it didn't. When they finished, a guard gestured toward the exit. Back to quarters, ladies. The women stood, dazed, their hunger sated, but their minds still hollow with disbelief. That night, lying on her bunk, the young woman from Osaka clutched the saved crust in her hand, holding it like a charm against the unknown. She could still taste the salt, the fat, the warmth. And for the first time since capture, she didn't cry herself to sleep, because something had happened. Not a beating, not a shout, a meal. And that was somehow more terrifying, because if the enemy could feed you like that, without venom, without threat, then what else might they be capable of? The women whispered the question in the quiet hours, turning it over like a stone in the hand. And then, just when they thought the contradictions had reached their limit, they were marched row by row toward the shower block. The guards called it delousing. The women heard rumors. Some stiffened. Others broke into a cold sweat. Back home, delousing often meant shaved heads, harsh inspections, humiliation in tiled rooms where dignity was peeled away like skin. A few clutched their uniforms tighter as they walked. One woman muttered a prayer beneath her breath. Inside the building, steam clung to the air like fog. The floors were warm, the walls were tiled but clean. A woman stepped inside and was handed something. White, fragrant, unfamiliar. A bar of soap, thick, smooth, smelling faintly of lavender. For a moment she didn't move. Her fingers curled around the soap like it might shatter. Then she stepped under the stream. The water was hot, not scalding, not icy, just warm. She gasped as it hit her skin, not from pain, but from the shock of comfort. The others followed, their silence dissolving into soft exhalations, coughs, the patter of water. No shouting, no barking guards, only the hiss of steam and the scent of soap rising into the rafters. One woman sank to her knees in the stall, water pouring over her shoulders. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She just stayed there, letting the dirt of months wash down the drain. When they emerged, towels were waiting. Clean undergarments, cotton dresses. A few women hesitated to change. What if the clothes were marked? What if they were being prepared for something else? But no orders came, no punishment, only space to breathe. And then, quietly, another moment unfolded. The prisoner who had arrived nearly blind, her glasses lost in the chaos of surrender, was summoned to the infirmary. She expected an interrogation, or perhaps a lecture about health protocols. Instead, the American medic greeted her with a nod and handed her a small black case. Inside were a pair of spectacles, simple, wire-framed, slightly crooked. He gestured for her to try them. She did. The world snapped into focus. Edges sharpened, lines returned to faces. She could see the room, the man's eyes, the writing on the wall. She blinked, stunned. The medic only said, "No one should have to live in a blur." She didn't understand all the words, but the meaning hit her like lightning. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. That night, in the recreation room, a few of the women wandered past the bookcase and into a corner where instruments were stored. One found a harmonica. She didn't know how to play, but she lifted it to her lips and blew. The note came out rough, uncertain. Then another, and another. The guards didn't stop her. They just listened. The music drifted through the dark like smoke, wrapping around bunks, brushing against skin. It wasn't a song of victory. It wasn't patriotic. It was human. And in the dark, beneath the soft hum of insects and breath, one of the women whispered, "What kind of war is this?" No one answered. But for the first time the silence didn't hurt. It healed. A few days later, the guards brought in boxes, cardboard, worn at the corners, filled with thin envelopes, blank sheets, and freshly sharpened pencils. They stacked them on the tables in the recreation hall, then stepped back without explanation. A translator, older and soft-spoken, cleared his throat and said it in halting Japanese. "You may write home. No censorship, no punishment, just write." The women didn't move. One glanced at another, eyes narrowed. A trap, it had to be. Nothing about this place made sense anymore, and this felt like another riddle. Write to Japan? Who would believe them? Who would even receive the letters? And if they did, what could they say? That they had been fed, clothed, allowed to shower, to laugh? That the Americans were not devils, but men with rough hands and too easy smiles? For a long time the paper sat untouched, but the idea lingered. It gnawed at them in the quiet hours, in the spaces between mealtimes and dusk. And then one evening, as the sun bled across the yard, a woman reached forward. Her hand trembled. She picked up a pencil like it might explode. She didn't begin with a greeting. She began with a truth. "They treat us kindly. I don't understand this war anymore." The words scratched softly across the paper. More followed. Another woman wrote to her mother, then to a sister, a childhood friend. Not all of them confessed their confusion. Some lied, half-truths mixed with memory. Others wrote simply to remember who they were, to remind someone, anyone, that they were still alive. The guards collected the letters each week. They didn't open them, at least not in front of the women. The translator nodded politely as he sealed the bundles, placing them in sacks marked for international transit. Whether they truly believed the words would reach Japan, none of the prisoners could say, but they wrote anyway, because silence had always been the weapon, and now words became the resistance. The act of writing was not just defiance, it was reclamation. It made them more than prisoners. It made them daughters again, friends, people with handwriting and histories. Even those who refused to pick up the pencil felt the ripple. One woman wrote a poem. Another copied a childhood recipe, even though she knew it would never be made again. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that some of the letters did reach Japan, smuggled through neutral channels, filtered through Red Cross hands, and when they arrived, they didn't vanish. They didn't go unnoticed. They were read, and they were feared. In Tokyo, a colonel held a letter trembling in his grip. He read the same line 3 times. "We are not beaten, but we are no longer sure we hate them." That was all it took. Back in the camps, nothing changed. The guards still walked with that strange ease. Meals were served. The harmonica appeared some nights, soft and clumsy. But there was a new edge now, not from the Americans, but from within the women themselves. They had spoken aloud what could not be said, and though the barbed wire still circled their camp like a crown of thorns, a different kind of boundary had been crossed. They had written their truth, and Tokyo could no longer control the silence. What grew next didn't come from orders or speeches. It came from dirt. One morning, the women were told they could volunteer for light duties around the camp, gardening, cooking, folding laundry. No punishment if they refused, no reward if they agreed. Just work if they wanted it. Some hesitated, their minds flashing back to labor camps and forced marches, but others, quietly, stepped forward. It wasn't duty that moved them. It was hunger, not for food, but for purpose. In the garden behind the main barracks, the soil was dry but soft. Rows had already been plowed, and some green already poked through. Beans, squash, maybe tomatoes. A few of the women dropped to their knees without a word and began pulling weeds. One of them, a former farmer's daughter from the outskirts of Kyoto, stared down at a sprouting leaf and felt something shift in her chest. It was not surrender. It was memory. A week later, she asked if she could plant something from scratch. The guards brought her seeds. She didn't recognize the label. "Zinnias," one of them said. "Pretty if you don't kill 'em." He laughed at his own joke. She didn't, but she took the seeds. She planted them. Meanwhile, in the recreation hall, the language lessons began, not with chalkboards or grammar books, but with gestures and laughter. One guard, a wiry Texan with a thick accent and endless curiosity, pointed to himself and said, "Cowboy." Then he pointed to his hat. Hat. He repeated both words in slow, dramatic tones, as though performing Shakespeare. The women giggled. One of them, braver than the rest, raised her hand, touched her sleeve, and said softly, "Kimono." He tried to repeat it, failed spectacularly. They laughed again, not mockery, release. By the second week they were exchanging nouns like candy. Spoon, hashi. Flower, hana. One woman drew a fish in the dirt with a stick, and the guard scratched his head. "Fish?" She nodded. "Sakana," he grinned. "Sakana," he repeated, with pride like a child mastering a spell. Something fragile was blooming, but the moment they would remember most came on a morning thick with mist. The Kyoto farmer was trimming dead stems near the edge of the fence when a guard walked up holding something behind his back. She tensed. He didn't speak, just stepped forward and slowly extended his hand. In it was a single yellow daisy, awkwardly picked, its stem bent, petals bruised at the edges. She froze. Every nerve in her body screamed to retreat, to reject the gesture, to protect herself. But she didn't. Instead, she bowed her head slightly. Not a deep bow, just enough. Then she whispered, barely audible, "Arigato." It was not friendship. It was disarmament. After he left, she sat with the flower in her lap. The other women gathered around, touching it gently, as if it might vanish. No one spoke for a long time. Later that day, one of the women brought the harmonica back out. Another started humming a tune from her childhood. The Texan cowboy tried to join in. His voice was terrible. But they didn't laugh at him. They sang with him. The sky above the camp remained fenced with wire and towers. But down in the dirt, among the weeds and songs and awkward words, something else was growing. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition, and recognition, they were learning, was harder to kill than hatred. That night, for the first time in what felt like a century, they slept. Not with one eye open, not with fists clenched under thin blankets, but deeply, quietly, fully. The kind of sleep that creeps in on tiptoe without asking permission. Outside, the camp lay hushed beneath a velvet sky. No air raids, no shrieking whistles of bombs, no rumble of boots. Just the chirp of crickets, soft and unhurried, and the occasional croak of a frog hidden in the grass. Somewhere near the guard tower, a guitar twanged out a tune. Clumsy at first, then steady. The chords drifted over the wire fence and slid between the barrack walls, brushing against ears like lullabies from another life. One woman turned on her side, eyes wide open, staring at the slats of moonlight on the floor. Another curled under her blanket, hand resting over the daisy she had pressed into a book. No one spoke. No one needed to. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. For so long, night had meant fear, but here, behind enemy fences, it meant peace. And then, quietly, from the far side of the room, a whisper. "I don't want to go back." The voice was thin, not defiant, not dramatic, just real. No one responded, but no one disagreed, because back home meant something different now. Back home was rubble, smoke, letters that never arrived, a nation still wrapped in fire and famine, parents buried, brothers vanished, futures erased. The life they had known before capture had not survived the war. But here, of all places, they were alive. They were fed, they were clean, they had names again. And that was dangerous, because survival had become its own form of shame. Japan had not prepared them for this, the guilt of waking up warm, the guilt of laughing at a cowboy's joke, of smelling flowers, of sleeping without flinching. Every comfort was a betrayal. Every act of normalcy felt like treason. One woman, once a proud nurse in the imperial forces, sat alone near the door. She stared out at the stars, bright and blinding in the open sky. In Japan, they'd been covered in smoke. Now they blinked like they were watching. She had told herself when she was first captured that if given the chance, she would kill herself. It would be honorable. But days passed, then weeks, and now months, and she hadn't done it. Why not? Was she a coward? Or something worse? Had she changed? The shame twisted inside her like a wire, but when she looked at the others, curled and sleeping, breathing softly like children, she felt something different. Not weakness, not betrayal, but endurance. The war had taught them to die, but this place, this strange, sun-drenched, wire-wrapped prison, was teaching them how to live again. And that, too, was terrifying. The guitar twanged again, a slower tune now, drifting into the deep blue of the night. The stars blinked on, the wind stirred the grass. Inside the barracks, no one cried. No one had to, because for the first time in years they weren't just surviving. They were resting, and outside, beyond the fences, the world kept spinning. But for one night, behind barbed wire and under foreign skies, the stars had returned, and the next morning a camera shutter clicked. It was barely noticed at first. A visiting American journalist had been granted access to the camp, a public relations move mostly. He was there to document humane conditions, to remind a war-weary public that America still held the moral high ground, even with enemy prisoners. The women were lined up near the garden beds, some weeding, some sweeping, some just standing in the sunlight like they were relearning how to breathe. The guards were relaxed, hats tilted back. One leaned against the fence post, squinting into the glare. And then, in the middle of the frame, a Japanese woman smiled. Not a forced grin, not a grimace, a real smile, small, uncertain, but unmistakable. She was standing beside two American guards, one of whom had just made a clumsy joke in Japanese about chickens and shoes. The timing was perfect. The sun lit her face. The camera clicked. She forgot about it almost instantly, but Tokyo didn't. Weeks later, the image appeared in a military circular, leaked, copied, passed around with growing fury. A Japanese woman, in American custody, smiling. The backlash was immediate. She was called a disgrace, a traitor, a stain on the empire. Commentators raged that the enemy had brainwashed her, that her spirit had collapsed, that she had brought shame to the uniform, the nation, the ancestors. But she didn't hear any of that, not yet. Inside the camp, she had simply smiled because she felt, in that moment, like herself again. Not a prisoner, not a pawn, just a woman standing in the sun, her hands dirty from soil, her lungs full of spring air, laughing at a joke that made no sense but still managed to be funny. When the guards showed her the photograph later, she gasped, not because she was ashamed, but because she hadn't realized it had been real. "I look," she began, then stopped. "Human." That's what she looked like. Back in Japan, the state-controlled media demanded answers. "What are we to make of a smile in chains?" one headline read. Military officials feared the psychological breach more than any escape. It wasn't the camp they couldn't control. It was the idea. The whisper that maybe, just maybe, the Americans weren't monsters. But inside the barracks, the photo became a different kind of currency. The other women passed it hand to hand when the guards weren't looking. Some stared at it for hours. Others laughed. A few cried. Not because she had betrayed them, but because she had reminded them what they still were. The woman in the photo didn't speak much after that. She felt exposed, unsure whether she'd done something wrong or right. But one night, while they were folding clothes, another prisoner leaned in close and said, "You smiled for all of us." That was when she understood. The smile hadn't been defiance. It had been a flare in the dark, a spark of something unkillable. And once you've smiled in captivity, and meant it, there's no going back to silence. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your voice helps these stories reach more people. The announcement came with little warning. A clipboard, a roll call, a date, repatriation. Some of the women burst into tears. Others went silent, faces unreadable. The war was ending, or at least this chapter of it. They were going home. Back to Japan, back to... what? No one knew what waited for them on the other side of the ocean. Their cities had been bombed, their families scattered. The empire that once seemed eternal now stood cracked and crumbling. And for the women who had survived behind enemy lines, who had laughed, eaten, and, yes, smiled, there was a question that no one could answer. Would Japan still recognize them? Or worse, would it punish them for surviving? The woman who had laughed during the cowboy skit sat by her bunk with a pencil in hand and a blank piece of paper in her lap. Others were writing to family, asking after sisters, parents, children. She wasn't. Her family wouldn't understand. Not this. So instead, she wrote to the American guard who had once handed her a tin mug filled with bitter black coffee. She hadn't known what it was, not at first. She had sniffed it, wrinkled her nose, then taken a sip out of courtesy. The taste had shocked her, sharp, earthy, foreign. But when she drank again, it wasn't just about the flavor, it was the act. She had been served, not ordered, not instructed, served. Now, months later, with the boat home drawing closer, she wrote not to explain herself, but to remember. "You did not win my loyalty," she wrote. "You gave me back my name." The pencil trembled in her fingers, but she kept going. "When I arrived, I was not a woman. I was shame wrapped in skin. I had failed my country by not dying. I had failed my father by breathing. But you handed me that coffee like it meant nothing, or maybe like it meant everything. You didn't see an enemy. You saw someone thirsty." She paused. The others around her were whispering, folding shirts, braiding each other's hair for the journey. One was crying into a pillow. Another was staring at a harmonica she would leave behind. No one talked about it, but they all knew. Some part of them would not be welcome back home, because Japan had sent them to fight and serve and endure. And they had. But they had also lived. And living now felt like disobedience. She folded the letter slowly. She would not mail it. There was nowhere to send it. But she tucked it into her bag anyway, between a bar of American soap and a flower pressed into paper. A few hours later, as the trucks rolled in, one of the guards, young, lanky, with boots too big for his feet, saluted them awkwardly. No speeches, no goodbyes, just a nod. A thank you without words. The woman who had written the letter looked at him. Not the same one from the coffee, but it didn't matter. She bowed, not low, not submissive, just enough. A farewell. When the gates opened, the sun hit their faces like a spotlight. They climbed into the trucks. Dust rose, engines started. None of them waved, but all of them looked back. Because behind those wires, in that strange, suspended corner of history, they had been transformed. Not because they were broken, but because somehow they had been seen. The years passed like wind over a quiet field, soft, unnoticed, but unrelenting. Decades later, a box was found in the back of a government archive, faded, water-warped, and almost discarded. Inside, papers, letters, notes, translations, reports, some typed, some handwritten, some smudged by age, others still crisp as the day they were written. They were the voices of women long forgotten by history, Japanese POWs, names no one had spoken in generations, stories no textbook had room for, and as the historians read, one theme echoed again and again. They treated us as humans. I expected pain. I found peace. They gave me coffee, soap, a mirror. I was not free, but I was not erased. None of the letters begged for sympathy. None begged for pity. They were not apologies, nor confessions. They were memories, fragments of moments that refused to be buried. One historian, a woman herself, wept silently as she read, not out of sorrow but recognition, because these weren't just war records. They were testaments to something history rarely honors, dignity in captivity. Some letters were written in formal kanji, others in broken English. A few contained doodles, flowers, stars, a guard's wide-brimmed hat. But every page offered the same quiet truth. The myths had been wrong. The Americans were not beasts, and the Japanese women, even in defeat, were not lost. One day, a documentarian tracked down one of the surviving women. She was in her 80s, living alone in a coastal town. Her hands shook. Her eyes had dimmed, but when he asked about the camps, her voice steadied. She didn't speak of battles. She didn't recount dates. She spoke of a harmonica, of a daisy, of a joke about chickens. Then, carefully, he unfolded the photo, the one taken so many years ago, the one that had once caused scandal across an empire. There she was, standing between two American guards, smiling. When she saw it, she laughed, not a quiet chuckle, a full laugh, surprised, nostalgic, alive. That, she said, tapping her finger gently on the worn image, was the day I realized I was still alive. The smile they had tried to erase, the memory they had buried, but the truth had lived on, in folded paper, in unspoken dreams, in the small, persistent pulse of a woman who chose to live. War had stripped them of their homes, their families, their futures. But in that dusty prison yard, beneath barbed wire and open skies, they had recovered something else, their names, their voices, their humanity. And long after the treaties were signed and the monuments erected, this part of the war, the quiet part, the soft part, remained, not in history books, but in hearts. Because sometimes survival isn't just endurance, it's joy, it's soap, it's music. It's a smile that refuses to vanish, and sometimes the most radical thing a prisoner can do is remember. If this story moved you, like this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These lost histories deserve to be remembered.